The tea always tasted slightly sweet. That's how he hid the sedatives. These words would later haunt the investigation into one of the most disturbing cases of identity fraud and murder ever documented in Oregon. A case that started with a simple cup of tea and ended with 4 dead wives, 3 missing bodies, and a manhunt that spanned across North America. But this isn't just another true crime story. This is about the monster hiding in plain sight. A man who turned marriage into murder, who used love as a weapon, and who almost got away with it all. If it wasn't for one small mistake, one tiny detail that didn't add up, he might still be out there today, brewing tea for wife number 5. Let me take you back to where it all began. Rachel wasn't looking for love when she found it. At 32, she had built a life she was proud of. Every morning, she walked into Lincoln High School with a stack of books and a coffee in hand, ready to inspire another group of teenagers to love literature as much as she did. Her students adored her. She was the kind of teacher who stayed late to help kids with college applications, who remembered their birthdays, who fought to get extra resources for those who needed it. The faculty lounge buzzed with whispers about how she was married to her job, but Rachel didn't mind. She had watched too many friends rush into marriages that ended in bitter divorces. She was waiting for something real, something that felt right. And then she met Michael. It was a rainy Sunday morning at First Presbyterian Church. Rachel almost didn't go that day. She had papers to grade, and the weather was miserable. But something pulled her there, some twist of fate that would later seem like a cruel joke. Michael was sitting in the back pew, a Bible in his lap, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain. He looked up when she walked in, and their eyes met for just a moment. Rachel would later remember how kind his eyes seemed, how gentle. After the service, they both reached for the same hymnal that had fallen to the floor. Their hands brushed, and Michael smiled, a soft, almost shy smile that made Rachel's heart skip a beat. "I'm Michael," he said, his voice quiet but warm. "I'm new here." That was the beginning, the first thread in what would become a tapestry of lies so intricate, so devastating, that it would take years to unravel. Michael told her he was an accountant, recently moved to Portland for work. He had a way of talking about numbers that made them sound almost poetic. The balance of debits and credits, the story that every ledger told. Rachel found herself drawn in by his thoughtfulness, his apparent depth. He listened when she talked about her students, asked questions that showed he was really paying attention. He remembered details about her life that even her closest friends sometimes forgot. Their courtship was old-fashioned, almost quaint. Michael never pushed for physical intimacy, always maintaining a respectful distance. "I want to do this right," he told her one evening as they walked through Peninsula Park Rose Garden. "I believe in building a foundation of trust first." Rachel thought it was refreshing. In a world of hookup apps and casual relationships, here was a man who valued connection over physical attraction. They spent their evenings talking about everything and nothing. Michael shared stories about growing up in Minnesota, a lie, about losing his parents in a car accident when he was in college, another lie, about his dreams of starting a family someday, perhaps the cruelest lie of all. Rachel opened up too, telling him about her own hopes and fears, never suspecting that each piece of information she shared was being carefully filed away, weaponized, future use. After 6 months of dating, Michael proposed. It wasn't grand or showy, just a quiet moment in Rachel's backyard, the stars twinkling above them. He had cooked dinner for her, nothing fancy, just pasta and garlic bread. But he had remembered how she once mentioned that her grandmother used to make her pasta when she was sad, how it was her comfort food. The ring was simple, elegant. "Like you," he said, as he slipped it on her finger. Rachel cried, overwhelmed by the feeling that she had finally found her person. The wedding planning should have been their first clue that something was off. Michael was adamant about keeping things small, intimate, No family, no friends, just the two of them, and a minister. When Rachel pushed back, wanting at least her parents there, Michael had a way of making his preferences sound reasonable, even romantic. "I want it to be just about us," he would say, his voice soft but firm. No distractions, no pressure, just pure love. He had an answer for everything. Why couldn't they wait a few months so Rachel's sister could fly in from Europe? "I can't wait to start our life together." Why didn't he want to take engagement photos? "I want to keep our love private, special." Each explanation seemed thoughtful, caring, but they were all carefully calculated to maintain his control, to keep his secrets hidden. The wedding was exactly as Michael wanted it, a small chapel outside of town, just as the sun was setting. Rachel wore a cream-colored dress she had found at a vintage shop, and Michael wore a dark suit that made his eyes look even more intense than usual. The minister was someone Michael knew, or claimed to know, an elderly man who spoke with a slight tremor in his voice. Looking back, Rachel would wonder if he was even really a minister at all. That night, in a small bed and breakfast on the Oregon coast, everything changed. Michael had insisted on pouring the champagne himself. "It's my job to take care of you now," he said, with that same gentle smile. Rachel remembered taking a sip, remembered how the bubbles tickled her nose, remembered Michael watching her intently as she drank. After that, things got fuzzy. She woke up the next morning feeling strange. Her head was pounding, her thoughts sluggish and confused. Her body felt heavy, almost foreign. When she tried to remember the night before, there were only fragments, pieces that didn't quite fit together. Michael was already up, fully dressed, making coffee in their room's small kitchenette. "You fell asleep pretty quickly," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Must have been all the excitement. That morning marked the beginning of a pattern that would continue for the next 18 months. Every night, Michael would make her tea, always the same blend, always prepared with the same careful attention. "It'll help you sleep," he would say, watching as she drank it. And sleep she did, deep, heavy sleep that left her feeling disconnected from herself, like she was moving through a fog. The changes were subtle at first, so subtle that Rachel barely noticed them. Michael took over their finances, insisting it made sense since he was an accountant. He suggested Rachel cut back on her after-school programs. "You work too hard," he would say, his voice full of concern. He started answering her phone when her friends called, making excuses for why she couldn't come to the phone. Each change was small, each limitation presented as an act of love. But there were moments when the facade cracked, when Rachel caught glimpses of something else beneath Michael's caring exterior. Like the time she came home early from school with a migraine and found him in their home office, hurriedly shoving papers into a drawer, or the way he would sometimes answer to a different name when lost in thought, then quickly correct himself. The monthly business trips were another red flag she should have seen. They always followed the same pattern. 3 days, always over a weekend, always to cities just far enough away to make checking up on him difficult. He would return with small gifts for her, trinkets that seemed thoughtful but generic. A scarf from Seattle, a coffee mug from San Francisco, a keychain from Denver, each item a prop in his elaborate performance. Rachel started noticing other oddities too. Michael never got sick. Not a cold, not a headache, nothing. He never went to doctor appointments, never needed prescriptions. When she mentioned this once, he laughed it off. "Good genes," he said, but there was something tight about his smile, something that didn't quite reach his eyes. The physical aspects of their marriage were strange too. Michael was always careful, always controlled. He never fully undressed, always keeping some part of himself hidden. He had explanations for this too. Religious modesty, personal preference. But there was something else. Something Rachel couldn't quite put her finger on. It was the little things that started to eat at her. the way he would sometimes speak in a slightly different accent when talking on the phone, how he never seemed to get mail addressed to him personally, the fact that he had no social media presence, not even old accounts. In an age where everyone left some kind of digital footprint, Michael seemed to exist only in the present moment. Rachel started keeping track of these inconsistencies in a small notebook she kept hidden in her classroom. At first, it was just a way to make sure she wasn't imagining things, that she wasn't being paranoid. But as the pages filled up, patterns began to emerge. The gaps in her memory always coincided with Michael's trips. The strange bruises she sometimes found on her body always appeared after nights when her sleep had been particularly deep. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Rachel had developed a persistent cough, and her doctor had prescribed antibiotics. The pharmacist, an elderly man who had known Rachel since she moved to Portland, looked confused when she gave her married name. "Thompson," he said, checking his computer. "That's strange. I don't have any record of a Michael Thompson being prescribed anything here. Are you sure he uses this pharmacy?" That question sparked something in Rachel's mind. She started paying more attention, started actively looking for the things that didn't add up. She noticed how Michael never used credit cards, always paid in cash. How he had no old photos, no yearbooks, no tangible connections to the past he claimed to have. One day, while Michael was on one of his trips, Rachel decided to do some digging. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she would find nothing and feel guilty for doubting him. But as she searched their home office, her hands trembling as she opened drawers and shuffled through papers, she found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden in a false bottom of Michael's desk drawer was a stack of documents, birth certificates, driver's licenses, social security cards, all with different names, but all with Michael's photo. And at the bottom of the stack, newspaper clippings from various cities across the country. Each one told a similar story. Local woman dies under mysterious circumstances, husband missing. The oldest clipping was from 5 years ago, from a small town in Minnesota. The woman in the photo looked familiar. Rachel had seen her before, in a picture Michael had quickly tucked away, claiming it was a distant cousin. Her name was Jennifer Miller, and according to the article, she had died in her sleep. The autopsy was inconclusive, but by the time questions started being raised, her husband had vanished. Rachel's hand shook as she read through the other articles. 3 more women, 3 more deaths or disappearances, each followed by the husband's mysterious departure. The names were different each time, but the pattern was the same. And now, Rachel understood. She wasn't Michael's first wife. She might not even be his last. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her life, wasn't just living a lie. He was a predator, methodically moving from city to city, creating new identities, marrying women. And then what? What happened to them in those nights when their sleep was too deep to remember? What happened on those business trips that always left them feeling strange and disoriented? Rachel knew she couldn't confront Michael directly. If he was capable of what she suspected, letting him know that she knew could be fatal. She needed proof, concrete evidence that would stand up in court. But how could she gather evidence when she could barely trust her own memories? She started planning carefully, methodically. She bought a small camera, hiding it in their bedroom where Michael wouldn't notice it. She collected samples of the tea he gave her each night, storing them in small plastic bags and hiding them in her classroom. She made copies of all the documents she found, securing them in a safety deposit box at a bank Michael didn't know about. But Michael wasn't as oblivious as she hoped. He started noticing small changes in her behavior. The way she hesitated before drinking her tea, how she seemed more alert during his business trips. She saw the way his eyes followed her movements, saw the calculation behind his gentle smile. One night, as Rachel lay in bed, pretending to sleep, She heard Michael on the phone in his office. His voice was different, harder, colder than she had ever heard it. "She knows something," he was saying. "We need to move up the timeline, get everything ready for next week." There was a pause, then, No mistakes this time. We can't afford another Jennifer situation." Rachel's heart pounded so hard. She was sure Michael would hear it. She knew she was running out of time. The next day, while Michael was at work, she gathered all her evidence and took it to the police. The detective who interviewed her, a woman named Sarah Chen, was skeptical at first. After all, Michael had built a perfect facade in their community. But as Rachel laid out her evidence, the documents, the newspaper clippings, the samples of tea that tested positive for powerful sedatives, the truth became undeniable. Detective Chen and her team set up surveillance, watching Michael's every move. They discovered he was planning to leave town, tickets booked under one of his fake names, accounts being cleared out. They also found connections to unsolved cases in 3 other states, all involving missing or dead women. But Michael had one more surprise left. When the police moved in to arrest him, they found the house empty. Michael had vanished, leaving behind only a note for Rachel. "You should have just kept drinking the tea." The note was typed. Like everything else about Michael, it left no true trace of him behind. The manhunt lasted 3 weeks. Local news stations ran his photo every night, warning people to be on the lookout. Rachel stayed with her parents, jumping at every sound, expecting to see Michael's face in every window. She couldn't sleep without checking the locks 3, 4, 5 times. The tea samples she had saved tested positive for a combination of drugs, sedatives, memory suppressants, and something else the lab couldn't quite identify. Michael, or Thomas Reeves, as they eventually learned was his original name, was finally caught trying to cross the Canadian border. He had dyed his hair, grown a beard, but his eyes were the same. Those kind, gentle eyes that had once made Rachel feel so safe now looked empty, devoid of any real emotion. In his car, police found detailed plans for his next target, another woman he had been grooming, another life he planned to destroy. They also found journals, dozens of them, detailing his previous marriages in clinical, almost scientific detail. He had recorded everything: how long it took to gain each woman's trust, what methods worked best for control, what dosages of which drugs produced the desired effects. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Rachel sat in the courtroom every day, watching as the man she thought she knew was revealed as a monster. Other women came forward, women who had dated him briefly before something made them pull away, women who had narrowly escaped becoming his next victim. Each one had a story about his charm, his thoughtfulness, the way he seemed to be exactly what they were looking for. The evidence was overwhelming. 4 women dead, 3 more missing, their bodies never found. Countless lives destroyed by a man who saw people as nothing more than experiments, nothing more than entries in his twisted journals. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. But for Rachel and the other survivors, the sentence didn't matter. The damage was already done. Recovery was a slow process for Rachel. She couldn't look at people the same way anymore, couldn't trust as easily as she once did. Every kind gesture seemed suspicious, every coincidence potentially sinister. She left teaching for a while, unable to maintain the bright, optimistic persona her students needed. But slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild her life. She started working with organizations that help victims of identity fraud and domestic violence. She shared her story, hoping to help others spot the warning signs she missed. She learned that survival itself is a kind of victory. Today, Rachel still lives in Portland, but in a different neighborhood, in a house she bought herself. She's back in the classroom, teaching her students about literature and life. But she also teaches them something else, something about trust, about paying attention to the small details that don't add up, about listening to that quiet voice inside that says something isn't right. The question that haunts her that still keeps her awake some nights is one that should make all of us think, how well do we really know the people we let into our lives? What lies beneath the surface of the relationships we think we understand? Michael, or Thomas, or whatever his real name might be, will spend the rest of his life in prison. But his other victims never got justice. Their families still don't know exactly what happened to them, still don't have bodies to bury or graves to visit. They're left with questions that will never be answered, grief that will never fully heal. This story isn't just about one man's capacity for evil or one woman's fight for survival. It's about the masks we all wear, the secrets we keep, and the terrible price of trust given to the wrong person. It's about the darkness that can hide behind the most gentle smiles, the most loving words. So the next time someone seems too perfect, too understanding, too exactly what you're looking for, remember Rachel's story. Remember that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. They're the ones sitting across from you at dinner, smiling as they pour your drink. The investigation into Michael's past revealed even more disturbing details. His transformation into a predator hadn't happened overnight. Police found records dating back to his college years, complaints from ex-girlfriends about controlling behavior, about missing time, about strange physical symptoms they couldn't explain. But he was always careful, always just within the bounds of what seemed normal. He had learned early how to walk the line between concern and control. His journals painted a picture of a man who saw relationships as experiments, pages filled with observations about drug combinations, about the effects of different manipulation techniques, about the best ways to isolate a person without them realizing what was happening. He had studied psychology, but not to help people, to learn how to break them. The most chilling discovery came from his laptop. Hidden in encrypted files were videos, hundreds of them. Videos of his wives in their drug sleep, videos of the experiments he conducted on them, videos of their final moments. Rachel couldn't bring herself to watch them, but the police who did said they had never seen anything like it. The level of planning, the methodical nature of his actions, the complete lack of empathy. It was beyond anything they had encountered. Detective Chen, who had first taken Rachel's case, spent months piecing together Michael's timeline. She tracked his movements across the country, following the trail of broken lives he left behind. In each city, the pattern was the same. He would arrive with a new identity, spend time establishing himself in a community, usually through a church or volunteer organization, and then begin looking for his next target. His victims were always similar, successful, independent women in their early 30s, usually with strong ties to their communities. Women who had built lives they were proud of, who weren't desperate for love but were open to it. He would study them for weeks before making contact, learning their routines, their preferences, their vulnerabilities. By the time he approached them, he knew exactly who they needed him to be. The tea wasn't just about control, it was about creating dependency. The mixture of drugs he used was carefully calculated to create memory gaps, to make his victims question their own perceptions. Over time, the constant drugging would make them more suggestible, more reliant on him to tell them what was real and what wasn't. It was a form of chemical gaslighting, a way to reshape their reality according to his desires. During the trial, psychiatrists testified about the psychological impact of this kind of long-term manipulation. The victims who survived weren't just dealing with the trauma of betrayal. They were trying to reconstruct their own memories, trying to separate truth from carefully constructed lies. Some of them would never know exactly what had been done to them during those lost hours, those gaps in their consciousness. One of the most heartbreaking moments of the trial came when Jennifer Miller's sister testified. She described how Jennifer had changed after meeting Michael, who was then using the name David Anderson. How she had become more withdrawn, more uncertain of herself, how she had started forgetting things, missing appointments, seeming confused about basic details of her life. When she tried to talk to Jennifer about these changes, Jennifer would defend David, saying he was just trying to take care of her. The last time Jennifer's sister saw her alive, Jennifer had seemed almost like a different person. Her vibrant personality had dimmed, her confidence replaced by a constant anxiety. She kept apologizing for things that weren't her fault, kept checking her phone as if afraid of missing a call from David. 2 weeks later, she was dead. The autopsy initially ruled Jennifer's death as natural causes. No obvious signs of trauma, no clear evidence of foul play. But after Michael's arrest, when they exhumed her body for a second autopsy, they found traces of the same drug cocktail he had used on his other victims. He had been perfecting his technique, learning how to make death look natural. The details of Michael's early life, when they finally came to light, offered no real explanation for his actions. He had grown up in a middle-class family in Wisconsin, had done well in school, had never been in serious trouble. There were no obvious trauma triggers, no clear turning point that could explain his transformation into a predator. Some of the psychiatrists who evaluated him suggested he might be a psychopath, incapable of real empathy. But even that didn't fully explain the calculated cruelty of his actions. For Rachel, the hardest part wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that every moment of their relationship had been a performance. Every kind word, every thoughtful gesture, every seemingly spontaneous moment of connection had been carefully planned and executed. She had thought she was living a love story, but she had actually been cast in a horror movie without her knowledge. The process of rebuilding her life after Michael's arrest was complicated by the media attention the case received. True crime podcasts wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story. Writers wanted to turn her experience into books. Everyone wanted to know how she had survived, how she had figured it out, how she had escaped. But the truth was, Rachel didn't feel like a hero. She felt lucky. Lucky that she had found the evidence when she did. Lucky that she had acted on her suspicions. Lucky that she had survived. The other survivors formed a support group, meeting monthly to share their experiences and help each other heal. They called themselves the Tea Club, a dark joke that helped them reclaim some of their power. Together, they worked through their trauma, helped each other fill in memory gaps, and supported each other through nightmares and panic attacks. They became a family of sorts, bound together by their shared experience of survival. Rachel's return to teaching wasn't easy. Her students had questions about her absence, about the news stories they had seen. She decided to be honest with them, within appropriate limits. She turned her experience into a lesson about trust, about paying attention to red flags, about the importance of listening to your instincts. Her students responded with empathy and support, many of them sharing their own stories of times when something hadn't felt right, but they hadn't known why. The case changed police procedures in several states. New protocols were established for investigating suspicious deaths in marriages, particularly when one spouse had limited social connections or documented history. Detective Chen developed a training program for officers, teaching them to look for the subtle signs of long-term manipulation and chemical control. But perhaps the most significant change was in how domestic violence organizations began to address chemical abuse in relationships. Rachel's story highlighted a form of abuse that often went unrecognized: the use of drugs and medications to control and manipulate partners. New screening questions were added to intake forms, and support workers were trained to look for signs of chemical manipulation. Today, Rachel still gets letters from people who have read about her story, people who recognize similar patterns in their own relationships or the relationships of people they love. She answers every letter, offering whatever guidance she can. She knows that somewhere out there, right now, someone else is living with a Michael. Someone else is drinking tea they shouldn't trust, Someone else is trying to piece together gaps in their memory. The question she asks herself now isn't just about trust, it's about awareness. How do we stay open to love while protecting ourselves from those who would exploit our capacity for it? How do we recognize the difference between genuine care and calculated manipulation? How do we help others see the danger signs before it's too late? There are no easy answers, but Rachel believes that telling these stories, shining light into these dark corners, is a start. Every time someone recognizes a red flag because of her story, every time someone questions a pattern that doesn't feel right, every time someone reaches out for help before it's too late, that's a small victory against the Michaels of the world. The tea set Michael used to serve his nightly drinks sits in an evidence locker now, along with his journals and the rest of his tools of manipulation. Rachel sometimes thinks about those delicate cups, about how something so seemingly innocent could become a weapon. It's a reminder that danger doesn't always look dangerous, that evil often comes disguised as kindness. What would you do if you discovered the person sleeping next to you was living a lie? Would you see the signs Rachel missed? Would you have the courage to act on your suspicions? Think about it, because sometimes the most important question isn't whether we can trust others. It's whether we can trust ourselves to act when something feels wrong. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Rachel's story. How would you have handled the situation? What warning signs do you think are most important to watch for? Remember, trust your instincts. They're trying to tell you something.